I preached this sermon here at St. Luke's on Sunday the 28th of June when the reading from the Hebrew Bible was from Genesis 22. The story of Abraham being asked by God to take his own son Isaac and offer him as a sacrifice. And at the last moment, an angel calls to Abraham and stops him, and then he sees a ram caught in the bushes nearby. You can read this text in full at the link below this video. May I speak in the name of God, the Holy Trinity, creating, redeeming, sanctifying. Amen. What are we to make of this terrifying and mysterious story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, as it is called in Jewish tradition? It is a story we would rather not hear, I think, a story we'd prefer to suppress and avoid for all sorts of reasons, as parents, as a preacher, as people of faith who want God and the world to make sense. Instead, this is a horrifying story of a demanding God, of a son who carries firewood for his own burnt offering, of a knife, and of a terrible death so close that the rabbis taught that as Abraham leaned over Isaac with the knife in his hand, tears dripped from his eyes into Isaac's eyes, and Isaac's vision was impaired for the rest of his life. In wrestling with this story this week, I've drawn comfort from knowing that we stand with millions of unknown people of faith who have struggled with its mystery and wrested meaning from it. The binding of Isaac is a story from the oldest part of the Hebrew tradition, told for thousands of years in oral tradition, before being written down and shaped into the text that we know today. As well as being foundational in Jewish identity and thought, it is part of the scriptures for both Muslims and Christians, and we also have pondered it for thousands of years between us. There are so many questions, and there are so many possible readings, and we have about 15 minutes. But where, for example, is Sarah, Isaac's mother, so fierce, the one who was barren for so long and then who laughed out loud when told that she was pregnant? Why does God's name change at the midpoint of the story when God intervenes? It changes from Elohim to the divine name that we translate as the Lord. And what about Isaac? Was he a child who didn't understand what was happening? Or was he a young man who went willingly, without struggle? And why did Isaac not return down the mountain with Abraham to join the servants for the journey home? And hardest of all, what kind of God would ask a father to kill his own son, his only son, the promise of Abraham's future? And to what end? Perhaps the point of this story, as a friend said to me last week, is to cause us to sweat over it, to struggle in the face of mystery, and to let go in the end of our desire to control, our desire to have a tidy ethical structure for our ways of being in the world. In the very first verse, we hear these words, God tested Abraham. And in the very last verse of the story, these words, the Lord will provide. This is the profound contradiction at the heart of this story. And Calvin once said of this, the command and the promise of God are in conflict. And Luther commented that this is a contradiction with which God contradicts himself. Now, Walter Brueggemann, one of the greatest modern-day Christian scholars of the Hebrew Bible, has this to say. The expositor, that's me, must take care not to explain, for it will not be explained. But without explanation, the text leads us to face the reality that God is God. So, here we are. God is God, but we are left at a loss for words, at a loss for explanation. Perhaps that's where we're meant to be, because that is sometimes where life brings us. There are times when it can feel like our faith is all about assurances and answers and ought tos, and there's no room there for the terror and the struggle and the bewilderment and the suffering that life brings us. This week I read a conversation, it was a transcript of a conversation, amongst a number of scholars from different traditions about the binding of Isaac. Amongst them were Phyllis Tribble, the great feminist Bible scholar, and Syed Hossein Nasir, an Islamic philosopher. And they were talking about how this story makes no sense as an ethical teaching, but that's not its purpose. Instead, it has to do with approaching the mystery of God. So it's not a religious story, kind of teaching us information. It's more of a mystical story, a narrative that outrages us and disturbs us and breaks things open. Phyllis then commented, "So it's not a good idea to make this into an ethical story, a should story, but it is very much alive as a descriptive story. This is the human predicament, and this is how God is perceived. And there's a terror and mysteriousness and inscrutability in God." The interviewer, Bill Moyes, then said, "Crucifixion, Holocaust, suffering, loss and pain, are these all at the heart of religion and revelation?" And Hossein, the Islamic philosopher, responded, "Remember that this story is a part of their holy text as well, and that Islam has also been wrestling with it for centuries, as we have." So Hossein said, "They are at the heart of human existence. You cannot exist in this world without these tragedies. Religion tries to make sense of them, but making sense is not always at a single level. But while this is not a should story on the level of external ethics, it is one on the level of mystical understanding. On the mystical level," he goes on, "Isaac is really our carnate, passionate soul that must be sacrificed before the altar of divine reality in order for us to really be a friend of God. Once you offer to sacrifice that soul to God, God always gives you something better. God will transform your soul into that which is luminous, full of charity and love, and close to God." So you can see he weaves a kind of allegorical reading in this story. And this is a snippet from a much longer conversation, and I share it not so much to say, this is the meaning of this terrifying story, and this is how we should live in response to it. We ought to have faith like Abraham. But instead to say, this is a complex story that opens a door onto the immense mystery of our existence and the pain and the struggle we sometimes experience. All Abraham can say over and over again is, "Here I am." Like Job, though everything is being taken from Abraham and it seems that it is God who is demanding this, Abraham will not turn away. In response to Isaac's question about the whereabouts of the lamb for the sacrifice, Abraham insists, this is the crux of the story, that God will provide. But in the moment of Abraham saying that, we don't even know whether Abraham is seeing Isaac as the lamb that God has provided, or believing that there will be another. But he continues to face God and say, "Here I am." Sometimes, when all our efforts to control and make sense of things are exhausted, that is all we can do in our living and in our praying. To stand in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the impossible contradiction that God is loving and this world is broken. To witness pain and suffering and refuse to turn away, but instead to say, "Here I am." God is holy. God is inscrutable and sometimes frightening. And sometimes in this world it feels like those are in tension with what we know of God as loving and gracious. This mystery cannot be explained. It can only be lived. And we live by continuing to face God, insisting, "Here I am." Amen. Thanks for listening. See you again next time.